Which bat will the New York Mets choose to add to their offense? Could it be Alex Bregman? Could it be a reunion with Pete Alonso? That is what we are going to debate here on today's edition of the Bleav in Mets podcast. Chris Schubert, Jack McKessie back with you here once again on the show. We appreciate you joining us. Jack, the New York Mets need to add another bat to this lineup. That is their next stated goal. It could be a reunion with Pete Alonso. The Alex Bregman rumors are hot and heavy, and so we are going to hash it out here. I have notes. I am prepared, paper form today. How are you, my friend?
I'm good. I've got some notes here, too. I was interested and intrigued by some of the numbers I found on Alex Bregman from this past season, so I'm excited to jump into it and have a little debate about which bat the Mets should take in their corner infield.
Yeah, so it could mean a lot. They sign Alex Bregman, it means Mark Vientos is probably moving over to first base. If they sign Pete Alonso, it means everything's going to stay relatively the same on that infield going into 2025. So a lot of different paths, a lot of different courses that this offseason could take for the New York Mets. I think the place that I would start here and looking into both of these players is they're both basically the same. Pete Alonso's 30, Alex Bregman's 31. You would argue that you're probably on the other side of their peak years. You probably aren't going to get a ton of excellent performance on the back part of whatever contract you put together here, whether it's a 5, 6, 7-year deal, whatever you give out to either of these guys. The last 2 or 3 years of those respective deals might be a tough pill to swallow, but you are looking to add offense to this team right now, and I think over the next couple of years, you can. This is a choose-your-own-adventure, truthfully. I went into this thought experiment leaning one way. I've come out of it leaning another way. And I don't want to give too much away before we dive into the players themselves, but I went into this expecting me to be like, I want this player on the New York Mets. And I came out of it thinking, at least, that I'm going in a different direction. Should we start with Pete, or should we start with Alex Bregman, the deep dive?
Well, first off, I just want to say I came away with the exact same takeaway. I went in thinking one thing, came out thinking a completely different thing. And I guess we could start with Pete, I guess. He's the more known quantity, so it could be easier to just talk about what the Mets will be getting from him because we have obviously seen what that looks like over the past 6 years.
We're going to debate Pete Alonso here first. We are also going to debate Alex Bregman, but there is no debate. BetOnline continues to be the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for online betting. From the earliest odds to in-game live betting, BetOnline provides you with all the action and the ability to watch the games as they happen with the largest selection of odds on everything from football, the NBA, and college basketball, NHL to UFC. Head on over to BetOnline today and don't forget to use our promo code Bleav, that's BLEAV, for your welcome bonus on your first deposit. BetOnline, the game starts here. So, listen.
Great segue.
Thank you. I that one was not impromptu. I had that one worked on all throughout the morning in the lead up to the show. I'm like, oh, we're debating. This is going to be my segue. So I kind of had that one in the back pocket here for the show. But let's start with Pete, right? Let's start with Pete Alonso because I think he's the guy that everyone here is going to be the most familiar with, watching him play his entire career with the New York Mets. And I think what we think of Pete Alonso's 2024 doesn't actually match with the numbers from his 2024 season. I think we remember his 2024 season as a bit of a disaster. We think of it as the pressure of the contract, free agency getting to him, and the slow start, and him really only coming on late. I mean, we know what he did in the postseason. We know what he did against Milwaukee in that third game of the National League wild card. So we know what he did in the postseason, but the lead up to that was a bit of a roller coaster ride. But when you look at it, 2024 wasn't as bad of a year as you probably thought it was thinking back on it.
The weird thing about Pete Alonso is it feels like 2024 was kind of the floor in what they might end up getting for the next couple of years, because in a lot of ways, 2024 was a quote-unquote down year for Pete because he had the lowest WAR that he had in a full-length season, I think, of his career. He had a lower batting average and on-base percentage that he did in 2022, which was a great year. 2023 was kind of rough. And he had the fewest home runs in a full-length season with only quote-unquote, 34. But at the end of the day, you're getting 34 home runs from a guy. You're getting 123 OPS plus, 122 WRC plus, and 2+ WAR from whichever metric you prefer, Fangraphs or Baseball Reference. And Chris, one thing I really also wanted to note here is Pete played in all 162 games this year, which is the 6th year in a row, or I guess 5th, not including 2020, that he's played in at least 150 games. And that kind of reliability and sustainability at a position like first base as a big time power hitter, I think is something that bodes well for how he will hold up down the stretch in a longer term contract.
Yeah, I'll let everybody know that in doing the research for this pod and for this episode, I looked at the last 3 years for both players. I wanted to encapsulate a decent enough sample size and not just look at last year, meaning 2023, and compare it with this current year, which is 2024. That feels like too small of a sample size. I wanted to get a longer runway to compare these guys. But at the same token, I didn't want to go too far back because then you're getting into their peak years, and that's not really fair to the player that they are now. So I ultimately settled on the last 3 years, and in doing so, it's kind of interesting the way it worked out. Bregman's 2022, he had a 137 WRC plus, which was one of his highest marks in his career. It wasn't a career high, but it was actually one of his better marks, so it's a really good starting point. And for Pete, the 141 WRC plus he had in 2022 was also a very similar top end of his career, despite it only being a couple seasons ago. So it felt like a really nice launching off point to see what these guys did over 3 years. And I'll tell you, the takeaway that I had from diving into Pete's numbers is he's been consistent in 2 areas that I think are really important when you consider the player profile that is Pete Alonso, right? Pete is your power guy. Pete is never, I know he's done it before, Pete Alonso hitting above 265 is not what he's here for. If you are signing Pete Alonso, you are signing him for high slugging, high OPS, 30-plus home runs, 40-plus home runs, and being a power threat in the middle of the lineup, whether he bats 3, 4, 5. You expect him to be a middle-of-the-order power bat, and you're going to accept that he's probably going to hit anywhere from 210 to 245, somewhere in there, but he's probably going to hit you 35 to 50 home runs. That's what you're signing up for if you give him a contract. And so with that type of player profile, the things you have to look for is he still barreling the ball? Is he still hitting the ball hard? Is he doing the things that allow him to still be a 35 to 50 home run guy? Because if that stuff starts to fall off a cliff, now you don't have somebody who can play every day. And the encouraging thing was his barrel percentage actually last year was higher percentile-wise, according to StatCast, than it was in that 2022 season when he had a 141 WRC+. His hard hit rate, highest of the 3-year sample size that I looked at 80th percentile. So those 2 things really jumped out off the page to me of, okay, Pete is still hitting the ball hard, and he's still squaring it up and hitting it with the barrel of the bat. Those 2 things combined with a decent average exit velo, 62nd percentile, which was a little bit lower than the 66th percentile it was in 2022. You add all that up, and you still have the profile of a player who can mash 35 to 50 home runs, and that's the place I want to start with Pete Alonso. In 2025, 2026, can he still be the productive player that the Mets need him to be? The question is unequivocally yes, based on looking at this.
I think the home runs is such an interesting metric to look at for Pete because, again, this was a quote-unquote down year for him, and he still hit 34 home runs. And that's not something that the Mets would be getting from a bat like Bregman's, who has hit around 20, 25 home runs for the last 3 years. He's never been able to reach the same heights as he did in 2019 with the maybe juiced balls. But Alonso is going to hit a lot of home runs. He's going to strike out a lot. And that's kind of what the Mets are signing up for if they give him a extension here. Another thing I found really intriguing about Pete Alonso's numbers were that his on-base percentage actually went up from last year as well. So even though he's still chasing and striking out a lot, he struck out the second most times he did in his career. He's still getting on base, and he's still hitting a lot of home runs. And going with that barrel percentage metric that you were using for the last 3 years, I think going forward, Alonso projects well for at least, the next 2 to 3 years, which would earn him this contract as a power hitting first baseman.
What I find so interesting, and to me, this is the wrinkle. This is the thing that the Mets and Pete need to figure out, because I just told you that his barrel percentage and his hard hit percentage is basically the same over the last 3-year sample size. Very similar to the numbers he put up when he had a 141 WRC plus in 2022, which, by the way, is the best of the 3-year sample that I'm looking at here. This is the wrinkle. This is what the Mets need to figure out. How can a guy have a chase rate that in the year 2022, where he had a 141 WRC plus, was 19th percentile? Like, just god awful at chasing pitches outside of the zone, yet was still able to put a 141 WRC plus up. Yet last year, in this 3-year sample, the highest it's ever been, 67th percentile, meaning he laid off of stuff. He didn't chase. How that doesn't correlate to him having a better season overall is thing number one that the Mets are going to have to figure out. And thing number two that they're going to need to figure out is he's striking out way more. 65th percentile strikeout percentage in 2022. Again, that's the first year of this 3-year sample I'm looking at. This past year, it was 30th percentile, and it has slowly gone down over the course of the 3 years. That's the... We assume Pete Alonso is going to get maybe 125, 150. That's the $150 million question. Can you get him to chase less? Can you continue this trajectory of him chasing less while also figuring out why he's striking out more? Because he's doing all the other things right. His whiff percentage is around the same. It's within a standard deviation margin of error here over this 3-year sample. His walk rate is basically the same. In fact, last year he had the highest walk rate of his career of this 3-year sample, 75th percentile. So there's a lot in here that goes, man, Pete should have had a much better year statistically probably than we got from him. But then there's also the underlying stuff of, yeah, he's just striking out a lot more. That's the problem. There are a lot of at-bats where Pete goes up there and he strikes out on 3 pitches, and it just looks ugly. And so that's the thing you have to get rid of. But, again, I went into this thinking that I was not going to like the under-the-hood numbers for Pete Alonso. That's where I thought I was going to end up. And looking at this, it's really not that far off from 2022 where he was really, really good.
Yeah, I think I really am glad that you brought up the chase and whiff and strikeout numbers, because I think that's a really good segue into what Alex Bregman's, at least his 2024 season looked like. Because according to the StatCast under the hood numbers, Bregman had really good, percentiles for his squared up chase, whiff, and K percentage.
Dude, elite. All 3 years I looked at, elite of the elite across the board in chase percentage, whiff percentage, strikeout percentage. Like, that skill, that is not deteriorated.
Right. But what is so weird about that fact is that Bregman's walk percentage in 2024 dipped down to 6.9%, which
went off the cliff.
Is significant because for the last 3 years, or the 2 years prior, it was at least 12.5%. I think it was up above 13% in 2022 and dipping more than, I'm using percent a lot. So dipping more than halfway below that number, taking half as many walks, despite the fact that he's still not chasing, he's still not swinging and missing, and he's still not striking out that much, is, I think, a little bit concerning, because you are bringing in another guy from outside the organization who you essentially are seeing as a replacement for Pete Alonso, and he's not getting on base as much. He actually had a lower OBP than Pete Alonso did this year, despite a higher batting average. He has a lower slugging than Pete Alonso did, obviously. He didn't hit as many home runs. And now we're seeing that part of the reason his on base is so low is because his walk percentage has, like you said, Chris, fallen off a cliff. And I don't know what the Mets are looking at to get to the reason behind some of those numbers, especially because, like I said, those chase and whiff and K percentiles are among the best in all of baseball, but he's still not walking as much as one would like.
Yeah, the two things that jumped out the page for me in compiling the 3-year look at Bregman is my dude 2 years ago had a 94th percentile walk rate. Last year it was 32nd percentile. That's not slow deterioration. That's not you're on the decline. That's what the heck is wrong with you. Like, that is what completely changed from your swing. And the other part of it, too, is when you look at this, I can't figure out what it is. There's one thing I can point to that is perhaps what's going on. His chase rate in 2022 was 99th percentile, was elite at laying off pitches. It dropped to 95th percentile. Okay, I'm not going to give you too hard of a time when you are still elite of the elite at chasing. But last year, it dropped all the way to 82nd percentile. So now I have a trend, and there's a major drop-off. So you're chasing more, and while, yeah, you're not striking out more, although it's a little bit less. It was 96th percentile in 22 and 23, and it dropped all the way to 94th percentile in 2024. He's still elite at strikeout percentage, although he did get worse in that regard a little bit. I can't figure out why his walk rate is so low. I can't figure out why his chase rate is completely fallen off the map. And so I think when you look at the two players, you need to see what can I fix if you're the New York Mets. Can I fix Alex Bregman's walk rate? I mean, he had an elite walk rate before. I don't know if that's a skill that immediately goes away. Do you forget how to take pitches? Maybe. Maybe just guys are throwing different stuff and you're just not used to it. You also have to worry with Bregman about taking him out of the Crawford boxes, right? He's maybe not the natural 100% pull hitter, but when you have that for 81 of your home games, that's an adjustment then when you go and play someplace else. And then the thing that I would add to Bregman's category that helps him over Pete is the one thing that has not gone away for Bregman is his defense. 91st percentile in range last year, where Pete was 3rd percentile in range as a first baseman. So it's an incomplete picture across the board. These are two flawed players. These are not perfect players. Alex Bregman is not the player that he was in the heyday of the Astros winning those titles. Pete Alonso is not the player who hit 50 home runs as a rookie. He is not the player that he was, I think, 2 years ago when he had a 141 WRC+. So the question you have to ask yourself is which of these two players, when looking at these samples and looking at what's gone wrong for them in the last couple of years, which player, if you're the New York Mets, do you think skills fit you better over the next couple of years? And which stuff that has fallen off do you think is easily fixable or things that you can work on in spring training? And I don't know. I go back and forth. I really do. I go back and forth on which player it needs to be because they're going to get about the same. Fangraphs projects Bregman 6 years, $162 million. They project Pete at 5 years, $125. That's like, it's a pick your poison. Which player do you want?
Yeah, that's what really blew me away when I was doing some of this research is so many of the contract projections for these two players are virtually the exact same. Like literally The Athletic projected each player's contract and they both came away with 7 years, $189 million for a $27 million average annual value for both Pete Alonso and Alex Bregman. So yeah, it's really coming down to what do the Mets value more and what do they think they can fix. And to that end, you brought up Bregman's fielding. He won the Gold Glove at third base for the AL this year. Like you said, he was among the best fielders in baseball with the 81 percentile fielding run value. Pete Alonso, 11th percentile for fielding run value. Mark Vientos, who Bregman would be replacing at third base, 17th percentile for fielding run value. So it's unquestionable that, Bregman brings a defensive side to him that you're not going to be getting from Pete Alonso. You're not going to be getting from Mark Vientos playing third base. But how much do you like those other under the hood numbers? How much do you like the fact that his walk rate is dropping off a cliff? Is that something that can be fixed? How do you like that his power is almost exclusively to his pull side at the Crawford boxes at, I can't remember the Astros' new stadium name, but in Houston? Pete Alonso, if you don't remember, has power to all sides. He hit a walk-off. He hit a go-ahead opposite field home run in the wild card against Devin Williams, as some of you may or may not recall. So really, it's just about what do the Mets value? What parts of these two players mean more? And also, how much do they value Mark Vientos as a third baseman versus as a first baseman? Right. Do they think that he really can project as a decent enough defensive first baseman that he can make that move comfortably and still keep up his offensive production near the top of the lineup? So I think when you look at these players, it's not just about what they are doing in a bubble, but it's also kind of about Mark Vientos and what the Mets think he can do going forward and what a position switch might look like for him.
And these are two different players, right? Like, you're not signing Alex Bregman to be the power producer that Pete Alonso is. If you bring in Alex Bregman to solve your offensive problems, you're saying, hey, we're going to bet on a guy who squared up the ball 96th percentile last year, a guy who doesn't strike out a ton, doesn't whiff a ton, and puts the ball in play, and we think there's value in that over, we're going to take a guy who strikes out a lot in Pete Alonso, but when he hits the ball to the moon. And those are two very different players. And then there's also and I don't want to put too much stock into this because it's a corner position, but we know how much David Stearns values defense. And I'm looking at StatCast, and I think outs above average is a number that David Stearns and the New York Mets put a lot into, that range number. And Alex Bregman is 91st percentile in that regard. And so, yeah, Mark Vientos was good at third base. He was better than advertised. He was better than we thought we were going to get there. But if you have a chance to get Alex Bregman to play third base, like, this is the exact reason why you would trade for Nolan Arenado, right? You would trade for Nolan Arenado because you know you're going to get Gold Glove caliber defense, and he isn't going to be MVP Nolan, but the production that you're going to get offensively is probably enough to also justify the switch to move Vientos over to first base. That would be the argument for signing Bregman, and I think there's a little bit more there with Bregman than there is with Nolan, so that's kind of where I lean. And I'll tell you here, this is how we'll wrap up. I went into this saying, I'm going to come out of this wanting Alex Bregman to be a New York Met. Like, that's how I walked into this, that I thought the numbers were going to bear out Bregman. And I came away going, maybe bringing Pete back isn't the worst idea in the world. Now, my pushback to Pete, and this has always been my pushback to Pete, is I don't think Pete can be a number one, number two, number three offensive option for your team. I think Pete works best as a complementary piece, right? I think, to use the football analogy, I don't think Pete's a number one wide receiver. I really don't even think Pete's a number two wide receiver. I think Pete's a really solid number three wide receiver that you put in the slot, you do some creative things in the backfield, and he helps your team win, but he isn't really the number one or number two. He's not Justin Jefferson. He's not Jamar Chase. And I think Pete Alonso is kind of that. You've got Francisco Lindor, you've got Juan Soto, you've got Mark Vientos. Oh, yeah, and then you also have Pete Alonso. Like, that's how the Mets should view it. And I just think if you bring Pete back, I think the stigma is going to be Pete's one of your best offensive players. Pete needs to do just as much as Francisco Lindor, just as much as Juan Soto, and I just think that's incredibly unfair, and that's not who Pete's going to be. Whereas if you bring in Bregman from the outside, everyone's going to view, oh, that's just on top of what we have. That's just in addition to what we have, and I think it would just, from a narrative perspective, would be different. I just think that's the way it would feel. So I think I'm Team Bregman, but more importantly, I think my big takeaway is here, I think either way I'd be okay.
I actually came away similarly, where I came in thinking that I was going to be blown away by Alex Bregman. I thought I was going to be convinced that the Mets should move Mark Vientos to first base. They should sign Alex Bregman to be their third baseman, and they'd be better off for it. I actually came away leaning more on Team Pete, and I think it's because of just how much more power that the Mets would be getting. This is an era of baseball where power really dictates success. And Pete Alonso has the capabilities of getting you to 35, 45 home runs in a season, where Bregman doesn't really have any of that. And Mark Vientos, I think, has the power to also be a serviceable, if not, elite power hitting third baseman in his own right. And so bringing in a guy that will move him off his natural position and not really give you the same power upside that Pete Alonso does, I'm not totally convinced of. Now, I think the biggest question for me, and obviously the biggest question for the Mets, is what Pete Alonso's contract is going to look like. And we discussed some numbers, 6 or 7 years, probably around $26-27 million a year. I think that's okay, but it's hard to know what it's actually going to look like, because like we mentioned in our last episode, there haven't really been any moves made in the free agency pool for position players. Like, it's Soto and Adames, and that's kind of really it. Like, there are other first basemen still available on the market. Carlos Santana, Christian Walker, we've had multiple conversations about. Obviously, Pete Alonso. There are also some third basemen that could be on the market as well. Paul DeJong is a free agent. I don't know if he's great, but like, if he's available, the Mets could be making a call there. I don't know what Pete Alonso's market is going to look like. I don't know what the general market looks like. And that's really, I think, what this is going to come down to, is what the value of each player looks like.
Yeah, and they're two different players, right? They are attempting to solve a problem, which is they need more offense. They need more length to their lineup. But these are two different players and two different ways to go about it, right? They're close. They're similar. But Bregman gives you the elite ability to lay off, the elite ability to not strike out. He used to have the elite ability to walk. Maybe 2024 is noise. Maybe it's just a blip on the radar. And that's a different approach than what Pete would give you, right? And so David Stearns and this front office has to weigh which direction do we think is better for the New York Mets. You have two guys at the top of the lineup that are going to provide you all-around good play. Lindor, Soto, those are high average, high on base, high power guys. Mark Vientos is probably going to be the 260, 270 hitter that also can mash 30 home runs. Brandon Nimmo is your contact guy. He's just going to put the ball in play, high on base percentage, keep the line moving. So what else do you need? Do you need somebody who also can keep the line moving and have some pop with Alex Bregman? Or do you want another thumper in the lineup that can hit you 40 home runs? That's the question the Mets have to ask themselves, and how they choose to answer that offensive question is I don't think there's a wrong answer between these two players. I thought that there was when I started this process. There isn't. I don't think there is a wrong answer. You are getting two flawed players. You are not getting MVP Alex Bregman. You are not getting MVP Pete Alonso. You are getting two players over the age of 30 who do some things well and other things they don't do very well, and you need to decide what warts, what flaws you're willing to overlook, and which ones are non-starters for you. And so that's the question that the New York Mets have posed to them. That is going to do it for us here on this edition of the Bleav in Mets podcast. We thought we would join the discourse. There's a lot of Bregman versus Alonso discourse. A lot of people not happy with the idea of maybe the Mets moving on from Pete Alonso and making Alex Bregman his replacement. A lot of people upset about that. So we thought we would jump into the discourse. We did the work, looked at the numbers, and it's close. I can see it going both ways for the New York Mets. But that is going to do it for us here on this edition of the pod. Make sure you rate, review, subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. You can also catch the video version of the show. Just search Jack McKessie on YouTube, and all of the video versions are there. We'll be back later in the week with another episode of the show, probably jumping back into some of the rumors and notes as the hot stove continues on for the New York Mets and all of the teams in Major League Baseball. But that's going to do it for us. We will talk to you next time. Let's go Mets.
Let's go Mets.